This chapter 4 centers on the structuring of a more complex instrument that incorporates both swaps and options to achieve higher returns for the investor, but also exposes the investor to the risk of a zero return. We now complicate the structure a little more by combining fixed and floating rate features over different times during the life of the investment. We continue to assume that 3-month LIBOR spot stands today at 0.5% and that the curve has steepened even further, so now appears as shown in worksheet fixed floating note about to appear in front of you. Here is the worksheet in question, and for now please note the 40 basis point gap between each LIBOR forward and the one immediately underneath it. The anemic level of LIBOR spot is making investors desperate for any sort of coupon enhancement that does not expose them to unreasonable risk. We assume that this particular investor wants to put money to work for a 3-year horizon, needs a fixed first-year coupon that is substantially above market rates, and then wants to be able to benefit from anticipated increases in rates after year 1. You are the dealer that has been approached by this investor with this request, so you will need to be compensated for structuring the transaction and for identifying an appropriate issuer with the requisite credit rating and sophistication. This issuer, in turn, will expect a funding rate lower than his usual rate for the 3-year tenor. Specifically, we assume that you need a 20 basis point upfront fee for your work, that the issuer expects a savings of 10 basis points annually for engaging in the transaction, and that the issuer normally would borrow at LIBOR flat for floating rate funding and at swaps flat for fixed. After some time talking to your structuring team, looking at screens, and drawing some pictures and arrows, you produce the term sheet appearing here. The pros and cons of this instrument should be pretty straightforward. First of all, a fixed coupon of 2.5% in year 1, i.e. 200 basis points above the current LIBOR spot of 0.5%. Second, most likely, even after the first year, a floating rate coupon consistent with the investor's desire, and one that pays a spread of 80 basis points over this issuer's normal coupon rate, unless the second part of the formula for the coupon kicks in, which would cause the coupon to begin to decline and potentially to reach 0 if 3-month LIBOR climbs to somewhere around 5%. Third, a moment's thought should confirm that the second part of the formula, i.e. the part that reads 14.8 minus 3 times LIBOR, kicks in, so to speak, i.e. becomes smaller than the first part of the formula, and therefore determines the coupon paid to the investor, only if 3-month LIBOR exceeds 3.5% in years 2 and 3, which would be 300 basis points above the current 3-month LIBOR spot. So this is remote enough that the investor may find this an acceptable risk in return for the substantial yield enhancement. Fourth, and finally, we observe a minimum coupon of 0, a crucial and very standard feature in most of these types of instruments to ensure the investor is guaranteed at least their nominal principal back at maturity, no less. We will devote the rest of this module to illustrating the process of constructing and pricing this instrument, and then to comparing its performance to that of a regular fixed rate or regular FRN. We need to emphasize one important point before we start. The explanatory approach we will take is to pretend first and inaccurately that it is the investor that engages directly in all purchases and sales of bonds and derivatives that are necessary components in the creation of the final instrument. But once you understand this exercise, we will then show how, in reality, the investor purchases one single instrument, exactly the one described in the term sheet with all its components. It is the issuer that in fact proceeds, if he so chooses, to strip out some or all of the derivatives embedded in the structured instrument and thereby convert his financing from one with complex coupon formulas to a more traditional straight fixed or floating rate note. This will become clearer once we provide a complete example. To begin, if we simply ignore the second part of the formula for years 2 and 3, we can intuit fairly quickly that the note is initially constructed out of a fixed rate bond that has been swapped into floating for years 2 and 3. To repeat, if we read only the part colored in red, we have a coupon of 2.5% in year 1, and then LIBOR plus 80 in years 2 and 3. So our first step is therefore to price a 2-year swap that starts in 1 year, and this is something that is not currently priced in our worksheet, fixed floating note. The easiest way to do this in the worksheet is simply to amend the formula for the 3-year swap over here in this cell R17 by removing from the calculation the first 4 LIBOR references and related discount factors. Thus H5 becomes H9 and G6 becomes G10, revealing a rate for the desired forward start swap of 3.48%, up from 2.67% previously for the regular spot starting 3-year swap. We are not surprised, of course, to find a substantially higher rate for a forward starting swap when the curve is so steep. We make a mental note of this 3.48% number and quickly undo the change and return the formula to its original form so we do not forget to do so later. So, under step 1 of the process for constructing the note, we ask the issuer to issue a 3-year note at his normal fixed borrowing rate of 2.67%. Remember that he borrows at the swap rate flat. And then we swap years 2 and 3 into floating, as indicated in this diagram. Unfortunately, this brings the coupon in year 2 and 3 all the way down to LIBOR minus 81 basis points, which would be unattractive to the investor in its current form, to say the least. The enhancement of this coupon to a substantial positive spread over LIBOR, as indicated in the term sheet, comes presumably from the sale by the investor of some form of options back to the issuer, whose premium is then allocated over years 2 and 3 to convert the negative spread of 81 basis points into the positive 80 basis points indicated in the term sheet. To figure out more precisely what the investor has done, we note that the two parts of the complex formula for the coupon in years 2 and 3 would become equal if L plus 80 equals 14.8 minus 3L, i.e. when L is 3.5%. At this LIBOR level, it is apparent that the investor goes from being positively exposed to LIBOR to being negatively exposed to 3 times LIBOR, specifically in the sense that her coupon diminishes by 3 basis points for each basis point above 3.5, by which LIBOR appreciates. In turn, this suggests that the investor has sold caps on LIBOR with a strike of 3.5%, and specifically that she has sold 4 LIBOR caps at that strike, the number 4 being the number that pulls an exposure of +1 all the way down to an exposure of -3. We need to be a little careful here and recognize that these caps are, to be very accurate, silent in year 1 and therefore active only in years 2 and 3. What we would be calling normally forward starting caps. Since the note's coupon in year 1 is fixed and falls completely outside the scope of the complex coupon formula for years 2 and 3. In this specific instance, the subtle distinction we just made is immaterial, since you can quickly confirm from the cap pricing grid in the worksheet that a 3.5% cap for the first year only would cost nothing, being so far out of the money. But of course, in other more normal cases where the strike is not so far away, we would need to remember to subtract the premium of the 1-year cap from that of the 3-year cap. Sale of these caps earns the investor 130 basis points upfront per cap, or in aggregate 520 basis points. Which is where the meat, as it were, comes from that will feed the arranger generate the investor subsidy for years 2 and 3, and allow even the 10 basis point subsidy for the issuer versus his normal funding cost. But before we distribute the goodies, we need to address a small problem here. Somewhere above a LIBOR of 5%, the formula would appear to give rise to a negative coupon. Yet the term sheet makes clear that this is not permitted. Specifically, the coupon formula would become zero if in fact LIBOR reached 4.93%, and would become negative if LIBOR goes any higher. A moment's reflection suggests that the investor needs to hedge herself against this by, in turn, purchasing some sort of interest rate options struck at this second critical level. Two observations that may take you a minute or two to fully grasp, however, are the following. That first, the options the investor purchases are once again caps, not floors, on 3-month LIBOR, since they need to be offsetting the investor's losses on the earlier caps once LIBOR rises above this strike. And second, the investor purchases 3 of these caps and not 4 this time, since her desire is simply to achieve a 0 coupon if LIBOR climbs past this level, and not to start earning positive coupons once again. You should please click pause and reflect upon these two observations if you are not completely convinced. The precise strike for these caps is calculated by setting 14.8 minus 3L to equal 0, which confirms the strike of around 493 alluded to above. We do not see this exact strike in our cap grid, but can simply go ahead and insert this strike in the worksheet, for example in lieu of the 5% presently there, revealing a premium of some 59 basis points up front per cap, or 177 in aggregate for the 3 caps. We will not show the calculation of this premium on the worksheet. We have done enough examples. You can obviously confirm this if you wish. But we point out that our earlier comment about needing to subtract the premium for a 1-year cap applies once again here, but once again such a cap would be worth 0, so we can conveniently ignore it. By now we suspect that you are struggling to figure out how these various options, bought and sold, will appear in the formula for the coupon in years 2 and 3. So let's address this issue right away. Using the standard notation for cap payoffs at expiration, which we discussed in detail, for example, in our module on interest rate options, we observe that the floating coupon for years 2 and 3, previously calculated to be LIBOR minus 81, can now be amended to read L minus 81 minus 4 times the payoff of the caps at 3.5 plus 3 times payoff the cap at 493, ignoring for now the option premium. We can best understand this formula by taking each interval in turn and simplifying the formula as revealed in this table here. So the range be L below 3.5, L in between 3.5 and 493, and L above 493. And this is beginning to look like the formula we saw in the term sheet, and will presumably come to resemble it far more once we add on the subsidy made possible by the net premia earned from the caps. Returning to these option premia, the investor has earned 520 basis points up front by selling the caps at 3.5, but has had to pay out 177 basis points to purchase the caps at 493, leaving a net 343 basis points to play with, so to speak. This is a good time to take care of the arranger, who requires 20 basis points up front for his efforts, as mentioned at the outset, leaving 323 basis points. The issuer also has requested a subsidy of 10 basis points per annum, you recall, which we will PV and deduct as well from this 323 basis points, thereby reaching the amount available exclusively to subsidize the investor. The calculation of the issuer's subsidy in present value terms is shown on this worksheet, Issuer Subsidy, and involves nothing more than the multiplication of each quarterly subsidy of 2.5 basis points by the appropriate discount factor, and then summing all these amounts to reach a PV of 28.4 basis points. Therefore, after we subtract this 28.4 basis points, a net 294.6 basis points are left finally to distribute over years 2 and 3 to achieve the investor subsidy for that period. Worksheet Annuitization 5 demonstrates how this is done and is very slightly different from the previous annuitization worksheets, since this time an upfront premium needs to be converted into a forward-starting annuity, and specifically one that is alive only during years 2 and 3, i.e. quarters 5 to 12, which we have highlighted. So here we set all entries in column D, including many of the ones hidden, to 0, except for the entries in these cells D9 to D16, whose formulas we keep as before. And now we goal seek for the entry in cell C28 that makes this item in D26 equal to 294.6, changing then the item in cell C28. Hit OK, and the solution in this cell C29 is revealed annualized to be approximately 158.5 basis points but of course paid quarterly. We just converted the upfront 294.6 basis points of available investor subsidy into 158.5 basis points per annum for years 2 and 3, which we reproduce in the bottom right cell of our table. We now add this subsidy into the table we had shown a minute ago, which now looks as follows, indicating everywhere a 2.5 basis point yield shortfall versus the formula appearing in the term sheet for years 2 and 3. But finally, we recall that our coupon for year 1, currently 2.57%, is a full 7 basis points higher even after the issuer subsidy than indicated in the term sheet. So, presumably, we are able to reduce this year 1 coupon by 7 basis points, increase that for years 2 and 3 by the missing 2.5 basis points, and even have a few basis points left over, shall we say, to pay the lawyers? A notion dear to your speaker's ears, being himself an ex-lawyer. We amend our earlier table one final time, as shown here. LIBOR plus 80, 14.8 minus 3L, and then ultimately 0 if LIBOR above 493. We have reached at last the term sheet originally proposed to the investor, which is repeated here for your convenience. So, is it really the investor that structures the note by purchasing the fixed rate instrument, swapping years 2 and 3 into floating, selling caps at 3.5, buying caps at 493, paying a fee to the arranger, paying a subsidy to the issuer, and finally redistributing the option premia over the life of the note? Of course not. The great majority of investors would not have the knowledge or sophistication to do any of this, nor the documentation in place to transact in derivatives as required here, nor most likely the creditworthiness to be an acceptable counterparty to the issuer under the swap and under the sold caps. So in fact, the issuer issues one single note with the exact term sheet shown above, and then may or may not hedge himself by, in effect, trading out of the various embedded derivatives with the arranger, not the investor, to return to a simpler form of subsidized fixed or subsidized floating rate financing. To make sure you understand this well, we provide a detailed illustration next. But please be clear that this is only one of numerous equally valid ways that this can be done. The diagram appearing here shows the issuer on day 1 engaging in the following actions. Step 1, issuing the structured note to the investor bearing the exact terms and conditions shown in the final term sheet that we saw above, in exchange for $100 of cash up front. Step 2, selling to the dealer 4 caps struck at 3.5% for an upfront premium of $5.20, which is our old 520 basis points. Step 3, purchasing from the dealer 3 caps struck at, recall, 493% for an upfront premium of $1.77, our old 177 basis points. Step 4, entering a 1-year forward starting 2-year quarterly pay swap with the dealer, under which the issuer pays $348 as we calculated earlier and receives 3-month LIBOR. And finally 5, paying to the dealer an upfront structuring fee of 0.2%, which is our old 20 basis points. We are not quite ready to test how all these hedges work, as we still must deal with one issue. In addition to raising the targeted $100 for a 3-year tenor, the issuer has collected up front an additional $323, this being the difference between the option premia reduced by the arranger's upfront fee of 20 cents. Rather than keeping this excess amount in his pocket, the issuer hands it over to the dealer, asking the dealer to repay it in the form of a quarterly subsidy on the swap, and specifically the fixed leg of the swap, over its 2-year life. Again, we hope you will trust us when we say, without wasting any further time to show it in Excel, that this turns into an annualized 172 basis points quarterly paid, which brings the fixed leg of the swap down all the way to 176%, again quarterly paid. We remind you that the caps in question are in reality 1-year forward start caps, but that in the present case the pricing difference is effectively nil. The easiest way to see the outcome of all this is via a table which shows the payments made by the issuer under each instrument listed above, so that receipts are shown in this table as negatives. If LIBOR is below 3.5, under the structured note, issuer pays L plus 80. Under the swap, pays on a net basis 176 minus L. And then the 2 sets of caps are still out of the money, so the total payments add up to 256. LIBOR lies between the 2 strikes, 350 and 493. The structured note switches over to 14.8 minus 3L contractually. The swap is unchanged, but now the first set of caps, which he is short, require him to pay additional amounts equal to 4 times the difference between LIBOR and the strike of these caps, and the aggregate of all this adds up once again to 256. Lastly, LIBOR above 493. The structured note contractually pays nothing. The swap is unchanged. The caps at 350 pay the same as before, but this time the long caps bring in 3 times LIBOR minus their strike, and once again the aggregate of all this represents a net payment or net cost for the issuer of 2.56. Therefore, the issuer has achieved all-in fixed rate 3-year funding at 10 basis points or so below his ordinary funding rate of 2.67%. The 1 basis point discrepancy being due to rounding. We conclude this chapter by evaluating the performance of this instrument versus simpler alternatives and discuss how to present this performance to the investor. We assume, as before, that the investor could have purchased 3-year fixed paper from the issuer yielding 2.67% quarterly paid, or floating rate paper yielding 3-month LIBOR flat. Obviously, it is not possible to state in a definitive manner when the structured note will outperform its two competitors, since the coupon under the structured note will reset a total of 11 times in aggregate, so that the various LIBOR paths may have very different IRR outcomes, and these are too numerous to evaluate comprehensively. By opting for the specific coupon she has accepted under the structured note, the investor ideally would like to see LIBOR remain low for the first few periods so as to justify her decision to go with fixed rate in year 1, and then for LIBOR to rise steadily after that, but not so far as to cause the coupon in years 2 and 3 to begin declining on account of the sold caps. We will define a total of 5 scenarios below and compare the investor's IRR under each one to what she would have achieved under the two competing instruments. You will quickly see that none of these paths is likely to materialize exactly as described here in reality. Scenario 1, LIBOR remains at 0.5% over the note's entire life. Scenario 2, LIBOR rises by 20 basis points each quarter, i.e. half as fast as implied by the forward curve. Scenario 3, LIBOR rises by 40 basis points each quarter, i.e. exactly as fast as implied by the forward curve. Scenario 4, LIBOR rises by 60 basis points each quarter, i.e. 1.5 times faster than implied by the forward curve. Scenario 5, LIBOR rises immediately to 3.5% and stays there until maturity. This is, of course, the best possible scenario for the investor. Worksheet IRR, which we have just opened, sets forth the IRR calculation for the structured note and the regular floater for each of these 5 scenarios successively on top of each other. Column C shows, of course, the LIBOR reset at the beginning of the period. Careful, this is no longer a LIBOR curve. It's the actual simulated path of LIBOR under each of the 5 scenarios. So you can see here LIBOR remaining constant at 0.5, scenario 1. Then in scenario 2, LIBOR rising by 20 basis points each period. In scenario 3, LIBOR rising by 40 basis points in each period, and so on. Column D derives from that path the coupon under the structured note. Column E calculates the cash flow under the structured note for each period, while column F calculates the cash flows under the regular FRN for that same period. Of course, we need cash flows to derive IRRs, so that finally at the bottom of each table, for example in cells E21 and F21 that we've just clicked on, the IRR annualized for each of the structured note E21 and the regular FRN F21 are calculated, but on a quarterly compounded basis, of course. We summarize the results from the worksheet in this table here before adding a few comments. First, and not surprisingly, each of the three alternatives ranks first under at least one scenario and last under at least one scenario, illustrating that in most instances with structured products and derivatives there are no free lunches, only trade-offs. Second, as expected, the structured note achieves its best performance on both an absolute and relative basis under scenario 5, when the variable coupon in years 2 and 3 resets for each quarter at its maximum level possible. Also, as expected, the structured note performs poorly on both an absolute and a relative basis under scenario 4, when LIBOR rises pretty dramatically, exceeds the critical 3.5% level as early as the 7th quarter, and continues rising thereafter, so that the variable coupon in years 2 and 3 declines steadily and indeed reaches 0 in the 3rd year. Point 4. The structured note performs pretty well under scenarios 2 and 3, these being scenarios under which LIBOR rises enough to generate attractive coupons in years 2 and 3, but not so much for the short caps to go seriously in the money. Somewhat coincidentally, the structured note's IRR under these two scenarios is almost identical, as you can see, to that of the fixed rate note. All in all, you may be disappointed that the structured note does not outperform its competitors by a greater margin and under more scenarios. But you should please keep in mind 3 things. First, the arranger structuring fee of 20 basis points up front and the issuer subsidy of 10 basis points per annum have caused, in effect, the structured note's IRR to leak by some 18 basis points annually. Second, the investment is principal protected, which makes it much harder to achieve substantial outperformance over short tenors. And third, at the end of the day, swaps and options are priced to have, remember, a 0 expected value, ignoring dealer margin and transactional costs, under the assumption that the underlying always moves towards its forward rate on average. While this assumption is known not to hold for a number of assets in practice, one of the most important examples being the tendency of LIBOR forwards to overstate the eventual outcome of interest rates, Deviations from this assumption are not that material in the long term, and therefore the ability to extract systematic value via structured notes should be taken with a pinch of salt. Structured notes permit the investor to express a view she holds strongly in an efficient, documentation-friendly, and simple to execute manner, without the investor being troubled by questions regarding her creditworthiness, her ability to handle the complex operational aspects of derivatives, or possibly legal or regulatory restrictions that might otherwise inhibit her flexibility. But in and of themselves, they are unlikely to generate consistent superior returns for investors versus more vanilla alternatives, and indeed should never be portrayed to have that capability. This completes this chapter 4 as well as part 2 of this module.